When a successful millionaire businessman invites his receptionist to a glamorous gala, he expects her to stay in the background, taking notes and handling minor tasks. But what he doesn't know is that she has a hidden talent that will leave everyone at the event speechless. As a medical emergency unfolds, Sophie steps in and saves a life, revealing a side of herself Elliot never saw coming. Get ready for a story of redemption, surprises, and the power of believing in someone's true potential. You won't want to miss what happens next. Subscribe now to discover how everything changes for them both. The sound of the elevator doors opening echoed through the sleek, minimalist lobby of Ward Tech, the cutting-edge tech empire that had propelled Elliot Ward into the ranks of the richest men in the city. Elliot's name, embossed in brushed steel above his office door, was a constant reminder of his relentless pursuit of success. But even with all his accomplishments, he never stopped moving, always chasing the next big deal, the next breakthrough. At 38, Elliot was the epitome of calculated brilliance. His sharp jawline and steely eyes gave him a look of perpetual seriousness, while his tailored suits were always immaculate, mirroring his need for precision in every aspect of his life. He demanded excellence from everyone around him, particularly his employees, who were expected to meet the high standards that his success had forged. There was no room for mistakes at Ward Tech. Sophie Miller, the company receptionist, was acutely aware of that. Her desk, situated just outside Elliot's office, was always a hub of activity, where phones rang incessantly and visitors checked in and out. Sophie had been at Ward Tech for nearly 2 years, and despite her best efforts, the job had become a precarious balancing act. She was in her mid-20s, with dark brown hair that was always a bit too messy and a tired look that never quite seemed to fade from her hazel eyes. Sophie was a quiet, diligent worker, one who'd learned to stay out of the way as much as possible, especially when Elliot was around. Most days, she managed to keep a low profile, answering phones, sorting emails, and managing the countless visitors and deliveries that flooded the office each day. But there was always the undercurrent of judgment from Elliot. He'd noticed her tendency to arrive late, sometimes just minutes, other times longer, and it annoyed him. His attention to punctuality was absolute. It was the first thing he'd learned as a young entrepreneur, and he held everyone around him to the same standard. He'd reprimanded Sophie more than once, his deep voice cold with annoyance. "Sophie, this isn't a charity. You're here to do a job. If you can't get it together, I'll find someone who can," Elliot had said in his usual blunt fashion. His gaze never wavered from the screen of his laptop, the words spoken more out of habit than true concern. Sophie, however, took it in stride. She didn't fight back or argue, which only seemed to fuel his frustration. She wasn't like the others, the ones who demanded attention and praise. Instead, she focused on her work, always going the extra mile to prove her worth, though the exhaustion she carried was becoming harder to hide. Her evenings were filled with medical textbooks, late-night study sessions, and the occasional shift at a local clinic. She wasn't just a receptionist. Sophie was balancing a dream, working toward becoming a doctor. The money from Ward Tech was her lifeline, and it allowed her to continue her education. But the toll it was taking was visible. There were days when Sophie's eyelids drooped with fatigue, and the deep circles under her eyes were hard to ignore. There were times when she could barely focus, but she never let it show. She knew that if she did, it would be yet another reason for Elliot to remind her that she wasn't cut out for the job. Sophie tried to keep her head down and her focus sharp. She didn't want anyone to know about her struggles, especially not Elliot. She was the last person anyone would expect to see in a doctor's white coat one day, and she was determined to prove everyone wrong, including him. But that didn't stop Elliot from making the occasional snide comment about her appearance or her lack of focus. "Sophie, are you even listening?" he had asked one afternoon, irritated as she fumbled with her notepad during a meeting. She'd nodded quickly, swallowing the lump that had formed in her throat. "Yes, Mr. Ward, I'm taking notes." But inside, she couldn't help but wonder why he had such little faith in her. It was a Friday morning when Elliot's impatience reached its peak. He stood in front of her desk, arms crossed, his face a mask of indifference. "I've been more than patient with you, Sophie, but I've had enough of these excuses. If you're going to be late again, I'll have no choice but to find someone else." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. but she kept her gaze steady. "I'm sorry, Mr. Ward. It won't happen again." His eyes narrowed as he looked her over, a momentary flicker of something unreadable passing through them before he sighed heavily. "Make sure it doesn't. I've got enough to deal with without worrying about my receptionist showing up late. I'll be meeting some important clients later. Don't screw it up." "Yes, Mr. Ward," she said quietly, her throat tight. As the day wore on, Sophie lost herself in the routine, her mind constantly flickering between her job and the textbooks in her bag. The gala dinner invitation had arrived earlier that week, and she'd tried to ignore the knot that had formed in her stomach at the thought of attending, but there was no avoiding it. Elliot had asked her to come, and for reasons she couldn't quite understand, she had agreed. When the day of the gala finally arrived, Sophie was already running on empty. The morning had been a blur of meetings, client calls, and last-minute errands. She had barely enough time to prepare for the evening ahead, but she knew she had no choice. When she stepped into the office that evening, her heart was racing. She hadn't been to an event like this in years. The gala was a prestigious event, an invite-only dinner that attracted the elite of the business world. Elliot had made it clear that he needed her to take notes and handle some minor work while he networked with investors and potential partners. He wasn't thrilled about the idea of having her there, but he needed someone to manage the details. "Don't embarrass me today," Elliot muttered, as he handed her a stack of documents that morning. His tone was clipped, businesslike. Sophie reminded herself that all she had to do was keep her head down, take notes, and make sure everything ran smoothly. She had no illusions about her place in Elliot's world, but she'd learned long ago that sometimes it was better to remain invisible. Sophie had barely made it to the gala on time, barely an hour to change and prepare after another long day at work. She stood in front of the mirror in her small apartment, pulling on a black dress that hung a little too loose around her hips and adjusting her makeup in an attempt to mask the exhaustion that weighed her down. Her reflection stared back at her, eyes tired but determined, lips pressed into a thin line. "Focus," she whispered to herself. She had a job to do, and it didn't matter that she felt like an imposter in the world she was about to enter. She wasn't here to be part of the glittering crowd. She was here to take notes, manage the details, and stay out of the way. After all, that was the role Elliot had carved out for her, one she had learned to accept despite her frustration. When she arrived at the venue, the sprawling ballroom was already abuzz with conversation, sparkling chandeliers casting a warm glow over the sea of impeccably dressed guests. She felt a brief pang of insecurity as she entered, the eyes of the well-dressed crowd flickering over her with little notice. In the midst of towering figures and opulent gowns, Sophie might as well have been invisible. But she had come to terms with that. Her place was at the sideline, and tonight, her job was simple: to make sure the event went smoothly for Elliot. She spotted him immediately, standing at the center of the room, surrounded by a small cluster of investors and business tycoons. He was every inch the successful millionaire: sharp suit, perfectly styled hair, and an air of confidence that seemed to command attention. He was laughing at something one of the guests had said, but Sophie knew better than to approach him now. She knew her role all too well. "Excuse me, miss," a polite voice interrupted her thoughts, and Sophie looked up to see a waiter offering her a glass of champagne. She took it, nodding her thanks, though she had no intention of drinking it. She was working. Forcing herself to take a steadying breath, Sophie moved to the back of the room, where a small table had been set aside. She placed her bag down and spread out her documents, notes, agendas, the ever-present to-do list. It was here, in the background, that she would remain for the duration of the evening. Sophie couldn't help but glance around at the crowd. The contrast between her and the guests was undeniable. The women wore elegant dresses that shimmered under the soft lighting, their jewelry catching the light with every movement. The men were tall, broad-shouldered, and confident in their tailored suits. Their laughter, deep and polished, filled the space like a symphony of power and success. Sophie felt the weight of it all. The sharp lines of her black dress seemed to blur against their designer labels. And then, of course, there was Elliot. He was practically a magnet in the room, drawing people in with his presence. She could see how the other guests gravitated toward him, their eyes filled with admiration, or perhaps envy. Sophie wanted to hate him for it, resent his ability to command every room he entered, but the truth was, she couldn't. Despite the way he often dismissed her, Sophie couldn't deny the sharpness and charisma that seemed to effortlessly flow from him. The evening began with typical business conversations, talk of investments, market trends, and future projects. Sophie, in her seat at the back of the room, was just another pair of eyes, taking notes and absorbing the buzz of the night. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she recorded key points and details that Elliot would likely request for. Sophie stole another glance at Elliot. He was laughing with a tall man in a dark tuxedo, a business partner from one of the major firms they were in talks with. There was something about the way Elliot smiled, effortlessly charming, that reminded her of how much she didn't fit into this place. Her eyes drifted down to her own tired hands, the pale skin almost translucent under the ballroom's lights. It wasn't that she didn't belong in the world of success. She was driven, smart, and had more ambition than most of the people in this room, if she was being honest. But something always held her back, that invisible wall between the polished lives of these wealthy individuals and her own. She wasn't sure if it was her social anxiety, the exhaustion that lingered from juggling two worlds, or just a sense of inadequacy that came with being the office assistant. When she caught sight of Elliot again, he was making his way toward her, his sharp gaze cutting through the crowd. He didn't look pleased. "Sophie," Elliot's voice was cold, barely a whisper as he approached her desk. "I need those notes before the next round of speeches." Sophie stood quickly, smoothing her dress with a nervous hand. "Of course, Mr. Ward. I'll have them ready shortly." "Good," he said, his eyes flicking over the notes on her screen, his expression unreadable. "And make sure everything is in order. These investors expect nothing less than perfection." Sophie nodded quickly, eager to get back to her work, but her heart was pounding in her chest. She hadn't realized how sharply the walls of his expectations had closed in on her until now. Perfection. That word seemed to haunt her wherever she went. In the world Elliot had created, there was no room for mistakes or flaws. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of formalities, champagne glasses, and polite conversations that felt more like a performance than genuine interaction. Sophie remained at her table, her fingers flying across the keyboard, trying to keep up with every detail. But despite the activities around her, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling of being on the outside looking in. Elliot's world was one of elegance and affluence, and Sophie was just a cog in the machine, someone who showed up, did the job, and disappeared back into the shadows. And for now, she was content to stay in the shadows, playing her part. As the evening wore on, the air in the ballroom began to thicken, with something that wasn't just the inevitable hum of social pleasantries. Sophie didn't notice it immediately, but the shift in energy was palpable. The room seemed to grow quieter, the once vibrant conversations tapering off, as if a collective breath had been held. It wasn't until a loud, sharp gasp cut through the murmurs that Sophie's attention snapped to the center of the room. A man in a dark tuxedo had fallen backward in his chair, his body slumping unnaturally, and the sound of the chair scraping against the marble floor echoed in the stillness. For a moment, the room froze. Conversations stopped. Laughter ceased. All eyes turned toward the fallen man. Jonathan Hale, a name Sophie had heard in passing, one of Elliot's target investors, lay unconscious on the floor, his face pale and his breathing shallow. His body was limp, crumpled in a heap, as if life had simply been drained from him in an instant. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She saw it all unfold in a matter of seconds, the chaos starting to ripple through the crowd. People screamed for help. A few guests rushed toward Hale's side, but none of them seemed to know what to do. Sophie could hear the frantic murmur of voices around her, but the sounds felt distant, muffled by the immediate pounding in her ears. Her eyes flickered to Elliot, and she saw him standing frozen, his face drained of color. "Elliot," a woman next to him said, voice high-pitched with panic. "What should we do?" Elliot didn't respond. His gaze was locked on the man on the floor, his posture stiff, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The tension in the air was suffocating, But it was clear to Sophie that Elliot was paralyzed by the pressure. He could do nothing but stand there, wide-eyed, at the center of a storm he couldn't control. He was a man of precision, a man used to orchestrating every detail of his life, yet now, in the face of an actual crisis, he was as helpless as anyone else in the room. But Sophie wasn't frozen. She was already on her feet, her heart hammering, but her mind was calm. Her years of balancing her job at Ward Tech with the grueling demands of medical school had prepared her for this moment. She didn't hesitate. Her steps were quick and steady as she moved toward the fallen investor, brushing past startled guests who were still unsure of what to do. She reached Hale's side and immediately dropped to her knees, her eyes scanning his face and checking his pulse. Her mind raced through the basics: airways, breathing, circulation. But there were no medical tools, no equipment to speak of, just the sheer instinct of someone who had spent too many nights in the quiet of a hospital's emergency room, surrounded by chaos. "Someone call an ambulance!" Sophie shouted, her voice clear and authoritative. A few people hesitated, unsure of who this young woman was, but the urgency in her tone left no room for doubt. "Now, and get me a glass of water." She didn't wait for anyone to ask questions. Sophie gently tilted Jonathan Hale's head back, ensuring his airway was clear, her hands steady as she checked his breathing. She could feel the weight of every eye in the room on her, but she pushed that out of her mind. A glass of water appeared at her side, and Sophie quickly poured it onto a napkin, pressing it to Hale's forehead to cool him down. It wasn't much, but it was something. She couldn't afford to waste any time. She quickly noticed a faint pulse beneath his skin, the beat uneven, but still present. "Sophie?" Elliot's voice cut through the chaos, his voice raw and strained. "What are you doing? We need to wait for the paramedics." Sophie didn't acknowledge him, her focus entirely on the man in front of her. The seconds felt like hours, but she didn't stop. She took a spoon from one of the nearby empty plates, its sharp edge something she never would have imagined using in this way, and used it to gently open Hale's mouth to check for any obstructions. When she found none, she adjusted his position, being mindful not to further strain his limbs, while keeping one hand on his chest to ensure his heartbeat remained steady. "Just breathe, Mr. Hale," she muttered under her breath, her voice barely above a whisper, as if talking to him would somehow help him fight his body's revolt. "Stay with me." The minutes stretched on, but it wasn't until Sophie could hear the wail of sirens in the distance that she allowed herself to breathe a little easier. She knew the ambulance would arrive soon, but for now, she had to keep him stable. Her hands were shaking slightly now, the adrenaline finally catching up with her, but she didn't let it distract her. Around her, the room was a mix of awe and fear. Guests murmured to each other, watching Sophie's every move with a mix of fascination and disbelief. They had expected someone like Elliot to handle this, a man with power, with influence, who commanded respect. But instead, it was the receptionist, the tired, unassuming woman who had been at the end of the hall throughout the event. She was the one who took charge in this moment of crisis. As the paramedics rushed in, their presence cutting through the chaos, Sophie took a step back, her pulse slowly beginning to return to normal as they took control of Jonathan Hale's condition. The swift professionalism of the medical team gave her a sense of relief, even though her mind was still racing. She watched as they moved with practiced precision, attaching monitors and pushing medication through IVs. She'd done what she could. She had stabilized him long enough for the professionals to step in, and now it was their turn. The room slowly started to return to its usual buzz, though the tension lingered. Conversations resumed, though more quietly now, and the high society chatter that had once filled the space seemed dimmed, as though everyone was still processing what had just happened. For Sophie, the event had blurred into a haze, each passing second feeling like a slow-motion replay of the chaos. Her eyes were drawn to the scene where Hale was being loaded onto a stretcher, his life saved by her calm and quick actions. She turned and slipped into the shadows of the ballroom, walking toward the back of the room. She needed a moment to collect herself, to breathe without the weight of so many eyes on her. She found a quiet alcove by the grand windows, overlooking the sparkling lights of the city below. Her hands were trembling slightly, the adrenaline finally draining from her body, leaving her feeling hollow. as though she were both grounded and floating in the same breath. She leaned against the wall, eyes closed for a moment, trying to center herself. It wasn't until she heard footsteps approaching that she opened her eyes, turning to find Elliot standing a few feet away, his usually polished demeanor looking uncharacteristically shaken. "Sophie," he began, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. There was a hesitation in his words, as if he wasn't quite sure how to speak to her after what had just transpired. She didn't say anything, though her chest tightened slightly. She wasn't ready to talk to him yet, not while the shock still lingered in her mind. But she had no choice. She could feel his presence, the weight of his gaze as it settled on her. He took a cautious step forward, his eyes scanning her face with an intensity that almost made her uncomfortable. You saved his life," he said, his voice a little breathless, as if still processing what had just happened. Sophie exhaled slowly, lowering her eyes. "I just did what anyone else would have done." "Anyone else?" he echoed, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Sophie, you were calm under pressure. You performed first aid, with nothing more than a napkin and a spoon. I've never seen anyone do something like that before." She looked at him, her gaze sharp yet resigned. "I didn't do it for the attention, Elliot. I did it because someone's life was on the line." The silence that followed was heavy, the weight of the moment pressing in on both of them. Elliot shifted his weight, clearly unsure of what to say next, as if suddenly realizing there was so much about her he had never bothered to understand. The distance between them, which had once seemed so natural, now felt like a chasm. Elliot's gaze softened, and for the first time that evening, his posture relaxed, as if a burden had been lifted. He ran a hand through his hair, his expression more vulnerable than Sophie had ever seen it. I don't know what to say. I've always just seen you as, well, my receptionist. Someone who came in, did her job, and left. But tonight, I saw something else. You're extraordinary." Sophie couldn't help but let out a dry laugh, shaking her head. "Extraordinary? I'm just trying to survive, Elliot. Just like everyone else. I'm not special." Elliot's eyes narrowed, a flash of confusion crossing his face. "What do you mean?" She turned her head slightly, looking out at the glittering city skyline. "I've been working here for the last few years, trying to make ends meet. But I'm not some polished businesswoman in a fancy dress. I don't belong here. I don't fit in this world of high society and investors. My life is a balancing act, every day. A constant struggle to make it through." Sophie paused for a moment, her hands now trembling from the release of tension that had built up inside her throughout the evening. She swallowed hard, feeling the weight of everything she had kept hidden for so long. "I've been attending medical school for years now while working here just so I can get my degree. And I'm always late, I know. I look tired and I probably seem like I don't care. But the truth is, I'm just doing whatever I can to survive and reach my dream." The words tumbled out of her in a rush, the confession finally surfacing after years of carefully suppressing it. She hadn't meant to say it like this, not to him, not in this way, but the events of the night had cracked something open inside her. She took a deep breath, her shoulders sagging under the weight of her vulnerability. "I'm not just a receptionist, Elliot. I'm trying to become a doctor. I've been juggling both for so long, it's exhausting. But that's the only way I can make it work." Sophie's voice faltered at the end, as if admitting this truth to Elliot made it all the more real. For a moment, she couldn't bring herself to look at him. She feared what he might think, whether his judgment would return now that he knew the truth about her. But instead of the expected disappointment or dismissal, Sophie felt the shift. The stillness of the moment settled between them, and she could almost hear his thoughts spinning. After a long silence, Elliot spoke, his voice lower, quieter than she'd ever heard it before. "I had no idea." His words were simple, but they carried weight. "No idea that you were going through all of this. No idea that you were carrying so much on your shoulders." Sophie finally turned her gaze to him, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes that she hadn't expected. Guilt, perhaps, or a recognition of the harshness with which he had judged her. She wasn't sure, but it was there. "I'm sorry, Sophie," he said softly, his voice filled with genuine regret. You've done more tonight than I ever could have imagined. You've shown me a side of you I didn't know existed, and I'm sorry for how I treated you before." Sophie gave him a small, weary smile, but it wasn't one of triumph. "It's okay, Elliot. I never expected you to understand. I just want to get through this night." Elliot stood there for a moment as if weighing her words. Then, with a slow nod, he stepped closer, his eyes softening. "If there's anything I can do to help, anything at all, just ask." For the first time, Sophie felt a flicker of something between them, something she hadn't known could exist in a relationship so formal and transactional. She had never expected him to offer any kind of understanding, let alone support. But in this quiet, shared moment of vulnerability, something seemed to change. A silent understanding had passed between them, and for the first time, Sophie felt seen, not as a mere employee, but as someone with aspirations, struggles, and strength. The morning after the gala felt surreal to Sophie. The calm of the office, with its usual hum of printers and phones ringing, stood in stark contrast to the storm that had unfolded the previous evening. Word had spread quickly. There had been a medical emergency at the gala, and a young woman, the receptionist, had saved an influential investor's life. By the time Sophie stepped into the office, there was an almost tangible change in the atmosphere. The whispers, the curious glances, the murmurs of, "That's the one who saved Hale," followed her every move. Her colleagues, who usually passed her by without a second glance, suddenly seemed to want to acknowledge her. Some gave her small nods of respect. Others looked at her with what Sophie could only describe as a mix of awe and pity. She wasn't sure how to handle it. The attention felt suffocating. It wasn't like her to be in the spotlight, and she certainly didn't want to bask in the aftermath of an event that, to her, was simply the right thing to do. She had done her part in the chaos of that night, but now it was over. Sophie slipped into her usual seat at her desk, her hands trembling slightly as she opened her computer. She tried to drown out the buzz of the office around her, burying herself in the work in front of her. But there was no avoiding the inevitable, the feeling of eyes on her. At the far end of the office, Elliot walked in. She could feel his gaze on her, but she didn't look up. Instead, she kept her focus on the monitor in front of her, typing out emails like she normally did. Elliot paused by her desk, shifting uncomfortably as he watched her work. He had barely slept the night before, the events of the gala replaying over and over in his mind. He had seen Sophie in a completely new light, and now, for the first time, he wasn't sure how to approach her. His usual sharp demeanor seemed out of place. He had always thought lowly of her, but now he realized just how much he had misjudged her. He cleared his throat, a little awkwardly. "Sophie?" His voice was quieter than usual, hesitant. She glanced up at him, her tired eyes meeting his, but she said nothing. I wanted to thank you," he began, but the words felt heavy. "For last night. You saved his life. I should have done more, but you handled everything with such grace." Sophie nodded, her fingers still hovering over her keyboard. "It's nothing," she said softly, wanting to downplay the whole thing. "I just did what needed to be done." But Elliot could see it in her eyes, that quiet humility that had always been there, the same humility that kept her from boasting or seeking praise. He found it both admirable and, in a way, frustrating. He had expected something else, a recognition of her actions, a sense of pride, but instead, he saw her deflecting, just as she always had. "I owe you," Elliot continued, his voice softer now, his expression unreadable. "I didn't realize how much I took you for granted. All these years I've barely looked at you as more than a secretary. But last night you showed me who you really are." He paused, the weight of his own words settling in. "You're not just some employee, Sophie. You're something much more than that." Sophie shifted in her chair, uncomfortable with the attention. "I don't want your sympathy," she said quickly, cutting him off. "I didn't do it for that. I just did my job." She met his eyes, her gaze steady despite the tumult inside her. "You don't need to thank me. It wasn't about you." Elliot winced, the sting of her words cutting through the moment. He hadn't meant to make her feel like she owed him anything. "I wasn't trying to make you feel that way," he said quietly. I just wanted to acknowledge that I've been wrong about you. About everything." Sophie stayed silent, her heart hammering in her chest as she processed his words. She could feel the sincerity in his voice, but part of her was still on guard. She wasn't ready to forgive the judgment he had passed on her for so long. She didn't need his validation. She had always done what she had to do to survive, to make it through. "I'll be fine, sir," she said finally, breaking the silence. "I've always been fine." Elliot nodded, his jaw tight. He wanted to say more, wanted to explain himself further, but Sophie's response was clear. She wasn't asking for anything from him. She didn't need his apology. What had happened between them in the past, his criticisms, his impatience, his lack of understanding, was already in the past. And yet, as the days went by, Elliot couldn't shake the growing realization that Sophie had been right all along. She had never needed him to see her as more than just a receptionist. She had been carving her own path, juggling the weight of her dreams and responsibilities with a quiet strength he couldn't help but respect. The days after the gala passed in a blur of routine, but for Sophie, nothing felt quite the same. The eyes of her colleagues often lingered on her a little longer than usual, and the soft whispers that followed her down the hall were hard to ignore. But despite the newfound attention, she remained focused on her work, knowing that the one thing she could always rely on was her dedication. As for Elliot, his demeanor toward her had shifted. No longer the cold, demanding boss he had been, there was a softness in his gaze when he looked at her now, a quiet respect that Sophie wasn't sure how to process. At first, the changes were subtle. Elliot began to involve her more in meetings, asking for her input on things that weren't strictly her job. She'd always handled his calls and organized his schedule, but now she found herself advising him on his upcoming deals, taking notes not just for him, but for herself too. She noticed that Elliot, who had once regarded her with indifference, now asked her opinion with an openness that surprised her. "Do you think we should go with the Lion partnership?" he asked one afternoon as they sat in his office reviewing the proposal. Sophie looked at the document in front of her, the familiar language of business deals swirling in her mind. She didn't just want to give the answer Elliot expected, she wanted to be honest. "Honestly, I think we need to consider their long-term goals more carefully. Their numbers are good, but their vision doesn't quite align with ours. We could be opening ourselves up to more risk than it's worth." Elliot raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed. "I didn't expect you to have such a strong opinion about it. Good catch." His tone was uncharacteristically warm, and Sophie's heart skipped. She wasn't used to getting praise from him, at least not without a caveat of criticism attached. It was the first of many small moments like that, where their professional interactions began to shift. It wasn't just about her taking notes or organizing things anymore. Elliot began to value her insights. He trusted her judgment in ways that went beyond her job description, and slowly, she began to see him as more than the billionaire boss with impossible expectations. One afternoon, Elliot called her into his office with a slight frown. She entered, her usual polite smile in place, but she immediately sensed something was different. He didn't look like his usual self, sharp, confident, in control. Instead, there was something more vulnerable in his eyes, an unfamiliar uncertainty. "Sophie," he started, glancing out the window, "I'm not great at this, at talking about personal stuff." He chuckled softly, a bitter sound. "But I don't know who else to turn to. I mean, I'm the boss and everyone looks up to me like I have all the answers, but the truth is, sometimes I feel like I'm just spinning my wheels, you know?" Sophie froze, unsure of how to respond. She wasn't used to seeing him so open. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice gentle, careful. He shrugged, looking down at the papers scattered on his desk. "I don't trust people, Sophie. I've spent so many years building this company, and it's been hard, really hard. People only want to be around me for what I can give them: money, power, access. And I can't shake the feeling that everyone around me is just waiting for me to screw up so they can take what they can from me." His words were heavy, laden with years of isolation and self-doubt. I don't even know who's real anymore." Sophie's heart ached at his confession. The man who had seemed so untouchable, so beyond the reach of anyone else's emotions, was now sitting before her, vulnerable and raw. She hadn't expected this, but a part of her understood it more than she could have ever anticipated. "I get that," she said quietly. "I really do." Sophie took a slow breath, as if preparing herself to open up in return. "I've been juggling so much in my life, medical school, work, trying to make it all fit together. And it's exhausting. I don't always have the energy to keep up with everything. But I keep pushing forward because I don't have any other choice. I've never had the luxury of trusting anyone either. It's hard to trust people when you're always worried about whether they see you as something more than just the person who helps them get things done." Elliot looked up at her, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You make it sound so simple, but I know it's not. I get it, though. I do." The exchange left them both feeling strangely lighter. For the first time in a long while, they shared something deeper than the daily grind of work. It wasn't just a conversation about business or deadlines. It was about their fears, their vulnerabilities, the parts of themselves they had never shown anyone else. "Do you ever wonder if we're just trapped?" Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Trapped in what?" Elliot responded, a hint of amusement in his voice, though it was clear he was trying to keep his tone light. "In our own lives," she continued, shifting in her chair, her eyes on the window. "In all the things we think we need to do, all the things we think we need to prove. You know, sometimes I feel like I'm just surviving, not really living. I don't know if that makes sense." Elliot didn't answer right away. He simply watched her, and for a brief moment, the walls between them seemed to dissolve. It was strange, this connection that had begun to form between them, subtle but undeniable. Neither of them said anything further for a moment, and for once, the silence didn't feel awkward. It felt like something deeper, something unspoken but understood. As the days wore on, the bond between them continued to grow, evolving into something that neither of them had anticipated. Their conversations became longer, more frequent. They talked not just about work, but about their hopes, their struggles, their dreams. There was a delicate tension between them now, a pull that neither could ignore. Neither was brave enough to admit it out loud, but the chemistry was undeniable. Their exchanges at times became filled with subtle flirtations, teasing remarks that lingered in the air long after they had been spoken. One afternoon, as they worked side by side on a particularly complicated project, Elliot caught Sophie glancing at him over the rim of her coffee cup. He raised an eyebrow, a playful grin tugging at his lips. "What's going on in that head of yours?" he asked. Sophie, caught off guard, blushed slightly and quickly looked back at her computer screen. "Nothing," she said, but there was a softness in her tone that made Elliot wonder if there was more to it than just a passing glance. "Right," Elliot replied with a mischievous glint in his eyes. "I think I can read your mind, Sophie, and I'm not so sure you can hide everything from me." Sophie laughed, the sound light and carefree. "You think so, huh?" "I know so," he said with a grin before turning his attention back to the project. At that moment, it felt as if the lines between boss and employee were slowly blurring, and Sophie realized with a jolt of surprise that she didn't mind it. As days passed, Elliot found himself thinking about her constantly. Her quiet strength, her intelligence, and her ability to rise to any challenge had shattered the rigid professional boundaries he had set for their relationship. Elliot had never been one for grand displays of emotion, but he knew he had to do something to show Sophie that he understood her, that he saw her for who she truly was. After a few days of contemplation, Elliot made a decision. He would take Sophie out of the environment she knew him in, the world of business meetings, deadlines, and office pressure, and show her a side of him that wasn't tied to his empire, a side that was vulnerable, honest, and real. He wanted to create a moment for the two of them that wasn't about business, but about the connection that had quietly bloomed between them. He arranged for a private dinner, far removed from the city's hustling life. The venue was a secluded restaurant perched on a hilltop, known for its intimate ambiance and stunning panoramic views. The only guest that evening would be him and Sophie. Elliot carefully planned every detail, from the serene setting to the food, and even the music. He wanted everything to be perfect. When Sophie arrived, she was visibly surprised. She had expected something more business-oriented, maybe a formal meal at a high-end restaurant, not this quiet, personal setting. As she stepped out of the car, her eyes widened at the sight of the restaurant, its golden lights twinkling like stars against the night sky, the air crisp and fresh, filled with the scent of pine and earth. "Elliot?" she said, her voice filled with wonder. "This place is beautiful." "I'm glad you like it," he replied, offering her a soft smile. "I wanted tonight to be different, for both of us." Sophie hesitated for a moment, as though unsure of what to expect. But she followed him inside, where they were greeted by the restaurant staff and led to a private table set by a large window overlooking the city. The view was breathtaking, but it was the absence of other people that struck Sophie the most. This was just the two of them, away from everything. As they sat down, Elliot noticed how Sophie seemed to be taking everything in, her guarded expression softening in the serene atmosphere. She had grown so accustomed to being the one who was overlooked and undervalued, that moments like this, where someone was showing her true consideration, were rare. She felt a flutter of something unfamiliar, a quiet, unexpected warmth that had nothing to do with the grand setting or the luxury around them, but everything to do with the person sitting across from her. They talked about simple things at first, the food, the weather, their favorite books. But as the conversation unfolded, Elliot found himself staring at Sophie. She had always been reserved, not wanting to burden anyone with her struggles or her aspirations. But tonight, the walls between them was non-existent, and they shared more than they ever had before. "I've been thinking about what you said," Elliot began, breaking a long silence. His voice was serious, softer than she was used to hearing. "About how I saw you." Sophie looked up from her glass of wine, her gaze steady, yet uncertain. "What do you mean?" "You've always been more than just my receptionist," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "I never saw that before. I saw you as someone who was just there to help me get through the day. But you're so much more. You're brilliant. You're strong. And I've been blind to that." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure how to respond. It had always been hard for her to accept compliments, especially from someone like Elliot, the man who had once belittled her for being late or too tired, the man who had never once shown interest in her as a person, but only as a cog in the wheel of his empire. "Elliot, she began, but he held up a hand signaling for her to let him finish. "I've made mistakes, Sophie," he continued, his voice thick with regret. "I've treated you like you were disposable, like your job here was all there was to you. And that was wrong. You've been juggling so much, working harder than anyone I know, and I didn't even take the time to understand why. I'm sorry." The sincerity in his voice caught Sophie off guard. She blinked, momentarily at a loss for words. In all the time she had worked for him, she had never heard him speak like this, not with such vulnerability, such openness. "You don't have to apologize," she finally said, her voice trembling slightly. "You didn't know. And I never told you. It was my choice to keep it to myself." Elliot's expression softened. "But that's just it, Sophie. I don't want you to have to keep it to yourself." Sophie smiled faintly, looking down at her hands. The weight of the conversation hung heavy between them, but it was a different kind of weight, one that felt right. It's not easy, you know? Sometimes I feel like I'm not really a part of either world. Not here, not in the corporate world, and not in the medical world either. I'm always in between." Elliot reached across the table and gently touched her hand, a simple yet meaningful gesture that conveyed more than words ever could. "You're not in between, Sophie. You're exactly where you're supposed to be, and whatever world you choose, I'll be here for you, because you matter. To me." Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes, but she quickly blinked them away, not wanting to ruin the moment. This wasn't just about the apology. It was about something far deeper. It was about the recognition of who she was and the possibility of what the future could hold for both of them if they dared to take the leap. "I don't know what the future holds, Elliot," Sophie whispered, her voice thick with emotion. But I do know that tonight, you've shown me something I never expected. Maybe I can start believing in myself too." Elliot leaned in, his expression earnest. "You don't have to be anything other than what you are, and that's more than enough." Everything seemed to be perfect at that moment. Sophie wasn't just a receptionist anymore. She was a woman with a future, with a dream, and with a man who saw her for who she truly was. As they shared a quiet moment, the tension between them melted away. There were no more barriers, no more hesitations. They had both come a long way, Elliot from his arrogant, work-obsessed self, and Sophie from a place of self-doubt and uncertainty. And as they sat there, in the glow of the dimmed lights, looking out over the city they had both conquered in their own way, they realized that this was only the beginning. The future was full of possibilities. Elliot took her hand in his, the gesture filled with promise. "I'm ready for whatever comes next," he said quietly, his voice filled with hope. Sophie smiled, her heart full. "Me too." And with that, they took their first steps into a future that was uncertain, but filled with potential, together. Life has a way of surprising us, and this story shows how one moment can change everything. If you were moved by Sophie's journey, there's so much more to explore. Click the next video to discover another unforgettable story. And if you're all about celebrating resilience and unexpected connections, make sure to subscribe. See you next time.